Hi guys, welcome back to Sacred Vedic Astrology. My name is Samantha and I am a professional Vedic sidereal astrologer. Today we're going to do a really fun in-depth chart analysis of the infamous Anthony Bourdain, and I really enjoy analyzing his chart. I've seen it before multiple times, and there's just so much strength and so much power in his chart for the exact life that he led of traveling and community and connection and food and writing and creativity and all these themes that are very, very prominent in Anthony's chart. So I know there was also a lot of tragedy that did surround him and a sort of tragic ending to his life, and I don't want to focus so much on that. I mean, we can see, why some of those struggles and mental health issues can come up through the chart, but I mainly want to focus on the positive and all the really amazing things that he did in his lifetime as well too, which was, traveling, connecting with different cultures, having this really amazing, authentic presence about him. Something I've always loved so much about his vibe and his energy is he was always just really authentic. And I think that you can feel that from someone. You can feel when someone is living authentically just when you speak to them, just when you see them, just when you watch them and what they do. And to me, Anthony Bourdain was really this image of authenticity, and he didn't follow any sort of formula of how to be on TV and how to do his segments, right? He was really just himself. And although there were struggles throughout his lifetime, there was also duality, right? There was also so many amazing things that he experienced and so many great things as well too. So I think his chart is such an interesting one to analyze because we see such a strength of his 12th house and Parivartana yoga, which is strengthening his 12th house of foreign travels and film and television, and then also strengthening his 11th house of community and groups and friends and connecting with people. So it's one of my favorite personal charts to analyze in Vedic astrology. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to pull up his chart so you guys can follow along as always. And again, I just want to emphasize that the thing I love the most about him and his energy and just who he was as a person was this sort of raw, real authenticity, right? He just felt like such a real, normal person, and it wasn't staged. It wasn't, it felt very real and very authentic and very true to who he was. So that's something I've always loved about him. I think he just has a really cool vibe. I love his openness and his groundedness and all these really cool things as well too. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up the chart as always so you guys can follow along and we can see what's going on in Anthony Bourdain's Vedic sidereal astrology chart. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Alright guys, so here we have Anthony's Vedic sidereal astrological chart pulled up. I love his chart so much, it gives me chills. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So Anthony was a Cancer ascendant, okay? So first house lord is the moon, right? So when someone is a Cancer lagna, their whole chart is ruled by the moon or Chandra. So his moon is in his 7th house. Okay, so when the moon goes into the 7th by direct opposition, it is aspecting the first, right? So the moon is the masses and fame. And so when the moon is in the 7th, it also goes into that first aspect, meaning that he's able to be seen by the masses in some regard. But first house lords in the 7th would show that there was a huge theme for him of learning and unraveling relationships in this lifetime. And with the moon there's a lot of secrets, there's a lot of illusions, there's a lot of sort of elusive energy, a lot of addictions and themes of addiction that come up in his relationships as well too. I know that he had this really sort of prominent relationship at the end of his life where people were saying he sort of gave himself into this relationship and wasn't really focusing on anything else. So what I was taught about moon in the 7th is that because the moon is our security and our sense of safety when it goes into the 7th house, people can feel overly attached in relationships where they kind of depend a lot on that other person, right? And there were also themes of addiction in his relationships because he was, dabbling in a lot of different substances, especially at the end of his life, which again, I don't want to get too into, but that moon in the 7th shows, rocky relationships. There's a lot of the sense of like his emotional security can come through his relationships, and there can be a lot of secrets, a lot of illusions, a lot of deception in relationships as well too. All right, so that first house lord in the seventh shows that relationships and business partnerships were a really huge theme for him in this lifetime as well too, and all sorts of connections with others and business, right? I see the seventh house as the house of business as well, so his whole chart is being ruled by that moon in the seventh. All right, so then we can also see as well too that we have a lot of planetary energy in his fifth house, right? So we have Rahu in the fifth, with Saturn retrograde in the fifth. So we see, I'll take Rahu as a more malefic energy, even though it's not always so malefic. I would say Ketu is more malefic when it comes to like the grahas, but if we're looking at Saturn with Rahu in the fifth house, can definitely cause issues with children because Saturn is a malefic. Rahu heightens that energy. So it's kind of like there's this two malefic energy in the fifth. And the other reason we can see issues with children is because his fifth house lord goes into the eighth house. So his fifth house of Scorpio gets disposited by Mars, which is in that eighth house of loss and endings and issues. So when I was analyzing his chart, I was wondering, like, did he have separation from his children? Did he not see his children? Were his children taken away? What is like all this sort of malefic energy and loss around children? Because the nature of Saturn with Rahu in the fifth, and then fifth house lord in the eighth with the malefic planet in that eighth house, which is dispositing that fifth, is not really doing any favors for children in his lifetime, right? So when I went into research on what happened, it turns out that like at the end of his life, he didn't see his child for like years, and he was kind of gone, and he was traveling, and he was distant. So Saturn is distant, Rahu is foreign lands and travel. It's in the house of children. Fifth house lord goes into the eighth house. Eighth house is loss, okay? So quite literally, he was traveling and was physically and probably emotionally distant from his child. Two malefics in the fifth house lord in the eighth house with a malefic in the eighth house. So we see a lot of malefic influence on that fifth house of children. It's not to say that, there weren't good times or also good things happening with children for him. It just more so means that we are going to see issues at some point manifest with the children, right? Two malefics, fifth house lord in the eighth house, Distana house with a malefic in that eighth house. So he did have a lot of separation from his children at the end of his life. So that's what that is all about. But, we can see those sort of darker aspects of the chart, but let's also move into some positive things of the chart. So what's really powerful in Anthony Bourdain's chart is his 11th house, Mercury, and his Venus in the 12th house. Okay, so this is creating Parivartana yoga between his 11th house, Mercury, and his 12th house, Venus, okay? So first of all, we see Sun in Ardra Nakshatra, conjunct Venus retrograde in the 12th house of Gemini, right? Ardra is the teardrop, it's sadness, it's tragedy. So again, we see these like darker themes in the chart 100%. When someone has Ardra in their chart, they can go through really intense life experiences, they can struggle a lot, and it's also in that 12th house, which is a house of loss. And there's definitely themes that we can unravel and understand in this chart that it wasn't all necessarily so positive and light. This isn't a chart of someone who just like hopped through life and had a really easy go at it. There's definitely a lot of struggles in this chart, but with the good comes the bad. So there's a lot of that duality. So we do see that Sun in Ardra with Venus in the 12th house of loss. But this is what's very interesting, guys, is the 12th house is also the house of foreign lands and foreign travel and film and photography and television, right? So we see Sun with Venus in the 12th house, and his whole career was around foreign travels, film, photography, television, and it was also around 11th house themes as well too, right? Because the 11th house rules groups and organizations and connecting with people and friends and connections, right? So his whole career was 12th house and 11th house oriented, and it was Mercury oriented, and it was also Venus oriented. So we see that Parivartana yoga between the 11th house and the 12th house, giving so much strength of those two houses and those two planetary energies, right? So we see Venus in Gemini in the 12th, and then we see Mercury in Taurus in the 11th, and Mercury is naturally in Gemini. Venus is naturally in Taurus. So we see an exchange of Mercury and an exchange of Venus, right? So it's like the 12th house lord is in the 11th house lord is in the 12th. That's how that goes. That's a way to understand Parivartana yoga. If what I said sounds confusing, you just want to see the 11th house lord is in the 12th house lord is in the 11th, and it's like they're giving energy back to each other. Okay, so that's between the planets Mercury and Venus, and between the houses 11 and 12. So Mercury is writing, Mercury is travel, Mercury is communication, Mercury is business, Mercury is sales, Venus is creativity, Venus, I do feel it can connect to like food because it's the more sensual pleasures of life. Venus is women. So because we have that Parivartana yoga, it shows that he was all about traveling, communicating, expression, and doing it creatively. You know, we don't maybe always think of like food and being a chef or cooking as something that's creative, but it absolutely is, right? So we see that Parivartana between Venus and Mercury is showing that he would travel and he would write and he would communicate and he would share and he would express all these things creatively, right? Between that Venus, Mercury, Parivartana yoga. And it's in the 12th house, 11th house, which the 12th house is foreign travels, film, photography, television. The 11th house is groups, cultures, you know, connecting with different people, large groups of people. And the 11th house is also large gains financially. So he definitely made a lot of money off of his travels and off his TV show, right? So that's that really strong Parivartana yoga between the 11th and the 12th house. So that's really his whole life story right there, right? Is 11th house themes and 12th house themes and Mercury themes and Venus themes of traveling and sales and business and foreign lands and foreign travels, right? So we can see his whole life story through that strength of that Parivartana yoga, okay? And what you'll find with Venus retrograde in the 12th is when a planet is retrograde, it's usually something that comes to someone later on in life. So for him, his TV show, his travels, because that Venus is retrograde, actually came to him as he got older, right? I'm not sure the exact age that he was when he started his TV show, when he started really traveling and doing that in a way that was sort of bigger, but I know he was older and he was kind of later on in his life, right? So that planet being retrograde means that it comes to him as he gets older as well, too. All right, and Sun with Venus in the 12th house, you know, there's huge themes for him in this lifetime of spirituality as well, and different cultures and understanding different cultures. The 12th house is foreign lands. So 12th house is like far, far travels, right? And his show is all about going to these extremely unique and unusual cultures and really understanding how to fit into those places and, you know, bring this to the masses. So that's that Venus, Mercury, 11th house, 12th house, Parivartana yoga. Best believe it. And also K2 with Mercury in a pretty tight conjunction in the 11th house. Whenever I see K2 in the 11th, people have like weird, strange, eclectic groups of friends. They can be like really connected to all sorts of interesting people, people from different cultures, people from all over the place. And K2 with Mercury can give very interesting writing ability and can give this sort of creative talent in someone's writing as well too. So he started his career as a writer, so he did a lot of writing, right? That's Mercury with K2 in the 11th, and also that Mercury-Venus Parivartana giving a strength of writing, right? Mercury and Venus are two very creative writing energies, and that Parivartana is strengthening all of that as well too. Okay. And also the 5th house is the house of writing books and publishing. So even though we see that, you know, Saturn and Rahu can definitely give malefic influence for children, it can also give benefic influence for writing and publishing, because Rahu can give us this like desire, this burning desire to go towards those 5th house themes. So he definitely had a huge interest in writing and publishing in his lifetime as well too. And Rahu in the 5th can also give a lot of intellect, a lot of mental energy. So there can be a sense of him really being in his mind, a lot overthinking. You know, he had this very strong intellect with Rahu in the 5th. I believe he went to a pretty good school, and from what I gathered, he was pretty intelligent. You know, Rahu in the 5th usually gives people very a lot of intelligence, and they're usually pretty well-read, well-studied, things of that nature with Rahu in that 5th house. So it's said in Vedic astrology, and something that my Vedic astrology teacher always taught us was that when you're looking into the chart of someone who works in the food industry, you always want to see connections between the 2nd house and the 6th house, okay? So this is really interesting. In Anthony Bourdain's chart, we see that his 6th house is, first of all, his Bhrigu Bindu point, right? So Bhrigu Bindu point can show where there's a really important house and an important theme in the chart. So for him, it's that 6th house, and the 6th house would show, service, the service industry. So when we see the 6th house is strong in someone's charts, they can work in the hospitality or food industry because, it's that service-oriented industry. So yes, the 6th house can be like healers and people who are health conscious and people who work in more healing, medicine fields, things like that. But also the 6th house is service and hospitality oriented as well. So you'll find a lot of chefs, a lot of people who work in the hospitality industry, hotels, things like that, will have a connection between their 2nd house and their 6th house. So his Bhrigu Bindu point is that 6th house, and it's in Mula or Sagittarius, which means it gets disposited by Jupiter, right? And Jupiter is travels as well too. So we see his 6th house is the Bhrigu Bindu, meaning there's an important theme for him of 6th house energy. And then also the 6th house gets disposited by the 2nd house with Leo, Jupiter in Leo in the Magha Nakshatra. So 6th house, 2nd house connection is what, is going to show someone who works in food or works in the hospitality industry or is a chef, a cook, things like that. So we see that 6th house, 2nd house connection, right? Because 6th house is also our daily work as well too. So his daily work involved the 2nd house, which the 2nd house is things that we ingest, things we put into our body. So 6th house, 2nd house connections show that people are connected in their work to food in some way, what we put into our bodies, what we ingest, things like that. Okay, and you'll find as well too, when people have 6th house, 2nd house connections, they're very conscious about the food they eat, or they have some sort of really strong connection or obsession with like food and what they put into their body with that 6th house lord in the 2nd house. Okay. And we also see Jupiter in that 2nd. So Jupiter in the 2nd can show there's, an expansion, a good energy around 2nd house themes, which is money, which is travel. And he was all about traveling, right? And then his 2nd house, Jupiter gets disposited back by that 12th house. So we see that 2nd house lord in the 12th. So it means that he makes money through travels, right? 2nd house of money goes into the 12th house of travels and foreign lands. And he was making money while he was traveling all the time, right? And then that 12th house is also the house of film and photography and television. So he was on film, photography, and television while he was traveling. All right, so that's how he was making his 2nd house money. And then because 2nd house is also food and what we put into our body, he was doing TV shows around food and what we put into our body. That is the 2nd house, 12th house connection, right? And then we see Sun with Venus there, which can show that there's a lot of like creative energy that is coming about in the travels and the film and the photography and the documentary, all that sort of stuff as well too. So really interesting to see just like how, spot on and specific all of that is. Something I do find very interesting in Anthony Bourdain's chart, and I had a feeling about this, he did struggle. Again, I was saying I didn't want to focus too much on like the darker aspects, but, I'm more so using this as something that's informative for us to also understand like what does cause more mental health issues or depression or things like that in the chart. And I was wondering if he had a Saturn moon aspect, and he does. So he has Saturn retrograde in the 5th house going 1, 2, 3 aspecting the moon. So in Vedic astrology, Saturn creates special aspects to houses that go 3 and 10 over. So it's like this. It's like Saturn's in the 5th. We go 1, 2, 3, aspecting the moon by 2 degrees. That's a really tight degree orb of conjunction, right? Saturn aspecting the moon by like 15 degrees is very different than Saturn aspecting the moon by about 2 degrees. So we go, Saturn is on his moon, on his 7th house, showing, emotional restrictions, depression. Saturn moon is a classic depression aspect that you'll find in a lot of people's charts who struggle with depression and struggle with lower energy and, more darker thoughts, because Saturn is so heavy and restrictive, and the moon is our mind and our mental energy. Okay, and then we also see Saturn is aspecting his 7th house, so it's also showing, issues with relationships and marriage. And I think he was divorced twice, I believe, or maybe he was divorced once and was with the second wife. But we definitely see relationship issues and a lot of intensity around his relationships as well, too, in this chart. So that's that Saturn aspect onto the moon, a lot of depression, a lot of mental health struggles. You'll find that a lot of people have Saturn moon aspects. And, there can be some sense of Saturn moon aspects also show someone who holds in a lot of their emotions and doesn't always express them. So I'm sure an issue that Anthony Bourdain had with such a strong 12th house and Saturn on his moon is he felt things very deeply. He was very sensitive. He's a Cancer ascendant. He has 2 planets in the 12th house, a Moshka house, a very sensitive house. But then we see that Saturn is on his moon, and there's this energy of like his emotions are very withdrawn or very private in some way as well too, and he wasn't always so good at expressing himself or expressing how he felt emotionally with that Saturn aspect on the moon as well too. And then we see Saturn is in opposition to Mercury in the 11th house, so there's definitely some sense of, Saturn, Mercury gives an ability for writing, right? Saturn with Mercury does give gives gifted, talented writers. So we can also see in many ways with, Rahu in the 5th, Saturn aspecting Mercury, Parivartana between Mercury and Venus, that he was definitely meant to be a writer as well too, and he was very gifted with writing and expression through that way. And I bet with that Saturn aspect on the moon, it's because he wasn't always able to express his emotions perhaps verbally, so a lot of that would come out with the written word as well. You also find with K2 Mercury that people have very interesting speech, or the way that they speak can be kind of like channeled or very outside of themselves at times. So Mercury K2 can give some sense of like feeling like his writing or his expression or his speech was more spiritual, more channeled. Like maybe he would say things and be like, I don't even know where that came from, right? You'll find that a lot with K2 Mercury. Definitely gives a lot of writing ability as well too with that K2 Mercury energy. So it's a very, creative, talented chart for writing and travels and all those sort of themes as well too. But we also see the aspects of depression with Saturn so tightly on his moon. And, there's also this energy in his chart with Mars in the 8th house and the Shadabhishak Nakshatra. That's the Nakshatra in Vedic astrology that connects to addiction. So you'll find that people who have Shadabhishak in their chart either have dealt with addiction or alcoholism themselves, or they're around people who have, right? It's in his 8th house of death and loss. So we definitely see an intense theme in this chart around addictions and mental health struggles as well. You'll find the Shadabhishak Nakshatra is very strong in people's charts who do have those struggles and those issues as well. Okay. So we can see all of it. We can see the importance of, the really strong importance of the Parivartana yoga between his 11th house, 12th house, Venus, Mercury, which is writing, expression, traveling, communication. 11th house is groups and organizations, and the 12th house is foreign lands and film and photography and television. So he brought all those 12th house and 11th house themes together, right? And his 6th house, Brigubindu point, he was meant to work in hospitality, work with food, be of service in his own way. And that 6th house lord in the 2nd is what you'll find in so many charts of people who work in the food industry or hospitality or chefs or cooks, because you want to see that 2nd house of what we ingest and put into our body connecting to the 6th house of service and work and, daily routines and what that person does for work, right? So that was a trick that my Vedic astrology teacher showed us in the charts. All right, so let's also pull up, I don't think I've ever actually looked at his D10. Let's see what's going on in his D10 chart as well, too. 10th house lord is in the 11th house with Mercury, Venus in the 11th. Yeah, so we can see in the D10, that's the 10th house, goes into the 11th with Mercury, Venus. We can see in the career chart as well too that he was meant to do these 11th house themes, which is like groups, organizations, connecting with people, connecting with different groups. And then Mercury, Venus goes there, which is expression, creativity, travels. And it was, his whole life, truly. So he had a really strong energy of Mercury, really strong energy of Venus. So he was really good with all of those sort of things that he did in his career. He was a writer. He was a, sort of television sort of guy. He was kind of like a journalist in certain aspects as well too. That's Mercury, Venus, 11th house, 12th house. So he was really, really gifted at those things. And his TV show was so, so popular. And he really did it in a way that was so unique and individualistic and different as well too. Also, another thing that's really important is his Atmakarka, or his soul purpose planet, is Mercury. So Mercury is writing, business, sales, communication, learning. You'll find with people who have Atmakarka Mercury, they never stop learning. They love to learn. They love to constantly discover new cultures and learn new things. And they're kind of like the constant student. So they love to learn. They love to travel, right? Mercury is also the Karka for travel as well too, and siblings. So maybe he had a strong relationship with a sibling. Mercury is also business. He obviously, was working in his own business. And Mercury is also very much this like salesy energy, which he wasn't actually salesy, but he was going around kind of, connecting people. And Mercury is talking, Mercury is travels, Mercury is expression. Mercury is that planet that likes to express and communicate and travel. And that's what his whole career and his whole life was based on, right? And Mercury is also speech and communication, and he did start as a writer as well too. And I think he got his big break, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he got his break when he wrote an article for maybe the New York Times or something like that. So he was definitely 100% also a writer as well too. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this chart analysis. The main takeaway from this is how important Parivartana yoga is, right? If I read this chart and I didn't understand what a Parivartana yoga was, I would miss all of that energy that is so strong in his 11th house and his 12th house and Mercury and Venus, right? And that's been his whole life. It's been connecting like-minded people, the 11th house, in foreign lands, foreign travels, the 12th house, through film, photography, television, the 12th house, right? Through Mercury, speech, writing, expression, travel, through Venus, creativity. It's all there in that 11th house, 12th house Parivartana yoga. Okay. So I hope you guys enjoyed this chart analysis into Anthony's chart. I really do just think he was such a cool guy, and, he really kind of carved out his own path in what he was doing. And, he definitely had his own mental health struggles. Saturn on the moon really doesn't do any favors. You also find Saturn, Rahu in the 5th doesn't really do favors for the mind or the mental energy either. It's overly active, and there can be, a lot of this overthinking and constantly in the head with that energy as well too. So we see it all, the good and the bad, right? Which is what's so cool about astrology and understanding people's charts, is that there is so much duality that lies in this world, right? It's not all good. It's not all bad. People are very dualistic, and charts are very dualistic as well too. So I think it's really cool to always see that energy in astrology and understand that everything is just exactly as it's meant to be. But the thing I love about astrology too is we take that little free will and we work with it, right? Where when I have clients who have really heavy Saturn moon aspects, I always tell them go to therapy, go do things that can help you get out of that sort of depressive lower energy, because it happens a lot with Saturn aspect on the moon, right? Especially Saturn retrograde means it's going backwards in motion. Okay, so it means that the Saturn energy is at times even stronger in someone's chart. Okay, and again, this created distance and disconnect from his children with that malefic aspect on the 5th house of children. And 5th house lord in the 8th house, the mind can be very 8th house-like, right? Obsessive, depressive, things like that. So we see all of that stuff. But back to my previous point, I'm a Gemini ascendant, so I can get off on these tangents. But his Saturn aspect onto his moon, when you know about energy and you know how to work with it, you can really work with things and kind of fix things and guide things along the way, where Saturn moon is a really, depressive aspect in the chart. And he probably would have really benefited from therapy or energy healing or an astrology reading, right? Things like that. When I see Saturn with the moon, it's really important for them to have these outlets that can help them deal with that more depressive, lower energy that they can really get into with that Saturn on the moon. All right, and also important to note that special aspects absolutely work in Vedic astrology. It's not just oppositions, it's not just trines. We have these planets that create specific aspects where Saturn is 3 houses over, 10 houses over, right? And if I wasn't using those special aspects, we'd be like, well, where's all the depression in the chart, right? It's Saturn on the moon to a T. I knew he had that aspect before I even pulled up his chart. So, all right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this chart analysis. Comment, like, subscribe for more. I'm always open for personal sessions as well, too. And I hope you guys have such a beautiful, blessed day. Comment down below any sort of, future chart analysis you want me to go into. As long as we have an accurate time of birth, and I feel like in the Rodin rating database system that it's pretty accurate, I can do those charts. But I like to see that the birth time is pretty accurate in order for me to do that. So his birth time was like 8:35. So because it's 8:35, we can assume that it's probably pretty close to the actual time of birth, because it's not just 8:30 or 8 p.m., right? We get that like 35 in there as well too. All right, we'll talk soon. Sending all the love.